In 1930, a photographer captured 5 men eating lunch on a steel beam 800 feet above Manhattan. No ropes, no nets, nothing but empty air, and certain death below. The image became an icon. What it does not show is even more disturbing. Those men were not daredevils. They were just doing their job. And every worker on that site would have called you a coward for suggesting they do it any differently. The real question is not how they survived. It is why an entire generation of builders chose danger over caution, and why that choice made perfect sense to them. The answer reveals a world where death was simply the price of progress, and no one thought to question it. By the 1920s, American cities were locked in a vertical arms race. Every major developer wanted the tallest tower, the boldest silhouette, the building that would define a skyline for generations. In New York alone, more than 30 skyscrapers above 500 feet rose between 1925 and 1931. The pace was relentless. The Chrysler Building climbed 77 stories in just 18 months. The Empire State Building added a floor every single day at its peak. Behind the gleaming facades and architectural ambition stood thousands of men who understood one unspoken truth: the schedule mattered more than their lives. Contractors operated under crushing financial pressure. Every day of delay cost thousands of dollars in interest payments, lease commitments, and lost revenue. A building that opened late might never recover its investment. So deadlines were sacred, and anyone who slowed the work, for any reason, was quickly replaced. In this environment, safety was not just secondary, it was often seen as an obstacle. Workers who raised concerns found themselves labeled troublemakers, men who could not handle the job. The choice was stark: accept the danger or find another line of work. This culture did not emerge by accident. It was built into the economics of construction itself. Most iron workers were paid by the piece or by the day, not by the hour. The faster you moved, the more you earned. A man who stopped to secure a safety line, or who waited for conditions to improve, was a man whose family ate less that week. Speed became synonymous with skill, and risk became proof of competence. The men who climbed highest and moved fastest earned the best wages and the most respect. Those who hesitated were left behind. The dangers these workers faced would shut down any modern job site instantly. Men walked narrow beams hundreds of feet in the air, wearing leather-soled shoes that offered no grip on wet or icy steel. They caught red-hot rivets with bare hands, juggling metal heated to 1,400 degrees with nothing but a tin bucket and quick reflexes. They rode the headache ball, a massive steel weight that swung from crane cables, hitching free lifts between floors rather than climbing down and back up. Foremen rarely objected. Time saved was money earned. Scaffolding was often little more than wooden planks laid across open beams, sometimes just 2 boards wide. These makeshift walkways flexed and bounced underfoot, threatening to buck off anyone who moved too quickly. Wind was a constant enemy, gusting between the steel columns with enough force to knock a man sideways. Yet work continued in all but the most violent storms. Rain slicked the beams. Snow piled on narrow ledges. Ice turned every surface treacherous. Still, the crews climbed, because stopping meant losing the job to someone willing to keep going. The hoisting operations alone would horrify any modern safety inspector. Derricks swung multi-ton steel beams over open streets, guided only by hand signals and the judgment of men who could not hear each other over the noise of steam engines and city traffic. Workers grabbed taglines to steady swinging loads, their bodies serving as counterweights against tons of moving steel. A gust of wind, a miscommunication, a moment's inattention, any could send a beam careening into the men trying to guide it. Some workers rode the loads themselves, perched on rising beams rather than climbing ladders between floors. They called it saving time. Today, it would be called suicidal. The riveting gangs worked in conditions that seem almost medieval by today's standards. A 4-man team would drive 500 or more rivets in a single shift, each one requiring split-second timing. The heater pulled glowing metal from a coal-fired forge and threw it through the air to the catcher, who snagged it in a bucket and jammed it into place before it cooled. One missed catch could mean a rivet heated to 1,400 degrees tumbling toward workers below or burning through clothing in an instant. The riveter then drove the softened metal home with a pneumatic gun that roared like a jackhammer. Hearing protection did not exist. Many of these men went partially deaf before age 40. What made workers accept these conditions? Part of the answer lies in the labor market itself. The 1920s brought waves of immigrant workers desperate for work, men from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe who had fled poverty and found themselves competing for the most dangerous jobs America had to offer. They understood that hesitation meant replacement. Behind every iron worker on a steel beam stood a dozen men willing to take his place. This oversupply of labor gave contractors enormous leverage. Safety complaints could be answered with a simple threat. If you don't like it, there's the door. But economics alone does not explain the psychology. Many of these workers genuinely believed that danger was part of their identity, that accepting risk was what separated them from ordinary men. The Mohawk iron workers from Kahnawake, near Montreal, became legendary for their fearlessness on the high steel. Their reputation grew from a tragedy. The Quebec Bridge collapse of 1907 killed 33 Mohawk men in a single afternoon, yet the community continued sending its sons to walk the beams. They did so not despite the danger, but because facing it had become a point of tribal pride. Among all iron workers, a code developed that prized courage above caution. Wearing a safety belt marked you as a coward, someone who did not trust his own skills. The leather harnesses available at the time were heavy, uncomfortable, and prone to snagging on rivets and bolts. But even if better equipment had existed, many workers would have refused it. The culture demanded that a man prove himself through exposure to danger. Those who showed fear lost the respect of their crews. Those who fell were mourned, but rarely used as arguments for change. Death was a risk you accepted when you climbed the first ladder. Veteran workers developed techniques that substituted skill for safety equipment. The heel hook became a signature move. A man would wrap his foot around a beam's edge, using the leverage of his ankle to lean far out into empty space, while keeping both hands free to work. Connectors learned to read a swinging beam's momentum the way a sailor reads waves, timing their movements to guide tons of steel with their bodies. These skills took years to master. Apprentices who survived their first season had proven something, not just competence, but belonging. The hierarchy on the steel was absolute. Foremen chose their own crews, and being selected by a respected gang leader meant everything. These positions passed through family lines and ethnic networks. Irish gangs worked alongside Italian crews, each maintaining their own traditions, their own initiation rituals, their own standards for what counted as acceptable fear. A man's reputation followed him from site to site. Show weakness once, and you might never work the high steel again. This fatalism ran deep. Workers developed superstitions and rituals to manage their fear: lucky coins, morning prayers, careful attention to omens. They told dark jokes about the men they'd seen fall, processing trauma through humor, because no other outlet existed. Many refused to learn the names of new workers until they had survived their first few weeks on the steel. Getting attached to a man who might be dead by Friday felt like tempting fate. The psychological distance allowed them to keep working, to return each morning to beams slicked with dew and wind that never stopped. Families accepted this reality as the price of a paycheck. Wives knew that any knock at the door might bring terrible news. Children grew up understanding that their fathers might not come home. Yet few pushed their husbands or fathers to quit. The alternatives, factory work, manual labor, unemployment, paid far less and offered little more security. At least ironwork provided wages that could support a family, even if the cost was measured in constant dread. The official death toll from this era remains uncertain, deliberately so. Contractors had every incentive to underreport fatalities. A death on site meant investigations, delays, and potential liability. Many falls were quietly attributed to worker negligence, and families were offered small settlements in exchange for silence. Insurance companies preferred quick payouts to prolonged legal battles. The system was designed to make deaths disappear from the record. The Iron Workers Union kept its own records, funding widows and orphans through contributions from surviving members. These informal ledgers suggest the true toll was far higher than any official count. Some historians estimate that one worker died for every floor built on the tallest towers. The Empire State Building's 5 official deaths almost certainly represent a fraction of the actual losses. Workers whispered about bodies removed at night, about accidents classified as heart attacks, about families who accepted cash and promised never to speak of what really happened. The truth was buried as deep as the foundations. Yet, change came slowly, and not because workers demanded it. The pressure for safety emerged from outside the industry, from journalists who documented the carnage, from unions that gradually gained bargaining power, and from a society that began to question whether progress had to cost so many lives. The Golden Gate Bridge, completed in 1937, offered a glimpse of what was possible. Chief Engineer Joseph Strauss insisted on safety nets beneath the span, a radical departure from standard practice. 19 men fell into those nets and survived, forming the legendary Halfway to Hell Club. Yet even this innovation had its limits. In February 1937, when a scaffold collapsed, the net tore away and 10 men plunged to their deaths. The real turning point arrived decades later, in 1971, when the Occupational Safety and Health Administration established federal standards for fall protection. Suddenly, the old codes meant nothing. The law required harnesses, nets, and guardrails. Inspectors could shut down sites and levy fines. Companies that had calculated worker deaths as a cost of doing business now faced a different calculation: the cost of ignoring safety. Some veteran iron workers resisted. They had built their identities around the old ways, around the belief that skill and nerve were enough. The new regulations felt like an insult to everything they had survived. But the law was clear, and the industry adapted. Technology evolved alongside the regulations. Modern harnesses weigh under 3 pounds and distribute force across the entire body. Self-retracting lifelines arrest a fall within inches. Safety nets stretch beneath every open edge. Training programs teach workers to recognize hazards before they become fatal. Every new hire spends hours learning to inspect equipment, to identify anchor points, and to understand the physics of fall arrest. The culture has shifted so completely that today's iron workers view their predecessors with a mix of awe and disbelief. The risks those men accepted seem almost incomprehensible from the vantage point of a modern job site. Statistics tell the story of that transformation. In the 1920s, construction deaths were so common they rarely made headlines. Today, every fatality triggers investigations, reports, and industry-wide reviews. Fall protection alone saves an estimated 5,000 lives annually. The iron workers, who once refused harnesses on principle, have been replaced by crews who would not dream of stepping onto steel without full fall arrest systems engaged. Pride now comes from professionalism, from bringing every man home at the end of the day, not from proving you could survive without protection. And yet, the buildings remain. The Empire State still pierces the Manhattan skyline, its steel frame assembled by men who balanced on beams no wider than a sidewalk curb. The Chrysler Building's Art Deco spire still gleams, riveted by hands that caught glowing metal from the air. These structures stand as monuments, not just to engineering ambition, but to a generation of workers who believed that courage and skill could substitute for safety. They were wrong, of course. Luck played as large a role as talent, and many men paid with their lives for a system that valued speed over survival. The lesson is not that those workers were foolish. They made rational choices within a system that gave them few alternatives. The lesson is that systems can change, that what seems inevitable in one era becomes unthinkable in the next. The men on that beam in 1930 were not braver than today's iron workers. They simply lived in a world that had not yet decided their lives were worth protecting. Today, every harness and guardrail carries the weight of that history. Every safety regulation exists because someone, somewhere, did not come home. The skyscraper builders of the early 20th century took risks. Modern workers would refuse instantly, not because we have grown soft, but because we have finally learned what those risks actually cost. Progress still rises toward the sky, but now it no longer demands blood as the price of admission. What forgotten risks do we still accept today without question? Share your thoughts below.